This oral history has been produced to provide an insight into training for war and in war from a junior commander's perspective. It is based on the experiences of a young tank troop leader, Lieutenant, now Colonel, Jerry McCormack. Colonel Jerry McCormack graduated from the Royal Military College Duntroon in December 1966. The first 2 years of his commissioned career were spent at the Armoured Centre completing his Young Officers course and at the 1st Armoured Regiment as a tank troop leader. In February 1968, Lieutenant McCormack deployed to South Vietnam, where he spent 10 months as a tank troop leader with 1 Troop C Squadron on operations, 1 month as C Squadron Liaison Officer, and 6 months as aide-de-camp to the Commander Australian Forces Vietnam, Major General R.A. Hay. His later appointments have been in the operations and training area and have included Tank Squadron Commander, Commanding Officer 1st Armoured Regiment, Instructor Tactics Wing Land Warfare Centre, Instructor Command and Staff College, and Commandant Land Warfare Centre. Colonel McCormack, welcome. What motivated you to join the Army?
I guess it was something I had always wanted to do. I had decided on a military career very early, I suppose, in high school, and then it was a natural progression of joining the school cadets, receiving the Duntroon literature, and then applying for a scholarship. And I must say, my whole family was delighted when I was told that I'd got the scholarship and was going to RMC.
What are your most vivid memories from your days at RMC?
I suppose the most lasting memories are the comradeship, the ability to have to get things done on time, and connected with the comradeship really was then translated in Vietnam when on a number of occasions I had 3 or 4 classmates and instructors who were with the force involved in the contact, and it just made operations so much easier because you knew the people that were on the other end of the radio, you knew how they thought and how they operated.
Why did you select armour as the corps to graduate to?
Well, actually, I was walking along in 4th class in the rain, and we on camp training, and we walked past the 1st class Armoured Corps graduates with their APCs and a canvas tarpaulin cooking bacon and eggs on a chufa. And I thought, that's for me. Why would anybody want to walk to battle? But seriously, I wanted to go to one of the arms. I thought infantry wasn't challenging enough, and I thought artillery fellows were far too affected to be real soldiers.
Can you describe how training was conducted at the Armoured Centre in 1967?
In 1967, in the tank phase of our young officers course, we were taught in great detail the basic crew drills and the basic crewman responsibilities, and then we progressed to tactics and gunnery. But in the tactics and gunnery phase, all of our training was for the rolling plains of northwest Germany, and that continued at the Armoured Regiment after leaving the Armoured Centre. I stayed on at the Armoured Centre and did a gunnery officers course, and when I got to the Armoured Regiment and joined C Squadron, we were launched out onto the Puckapunyal Range, and we conducted tank training as if we were in Europe.
So, as a young troop leader, how did you quickly develop a rapport with your troop?
I think there are 2 aspects to that. Firstly, you had to get to know your soldiers as well as possible, and the old troop leader's notebook was invaluable, but you also had to be able to carry out any of the crew drills or crew responsibilities, certainly as quickly and as good as anybody else in the troop. And that's an area in a tank. There are four crew positions, and all of the jobs are divided by 4, so you've got to be able to do it.
What guidance was given to you first up by your squadron commander?
He was very concerned that we once again got to demonstrate proficiency in our individual skills. Our gunnery had to be tops, your driving and servicing and your radio procedures all had to be very good. And that was, once again, one of the key issues of training a tank troop in those days.
Was this also a point that your first Squadron Sergeant Major brought out as well?
Very much so. And he made no bones about letting you know when any one of your talents was lacking or your devotion could have been a bit more dedicated.
How were you told that you were deploying to South Vietnam?
We were on the Puckapunyal Range on Tian's Flat. We had just finished a squadron advance. We were in a leaguer, and it was after dark, of course. And the squadron commander had called the troop leaders to his carrier for orders. And somebody who was on radio watch in one of the vehicles heard the announcement that the Prime Minister had said that a tank squadron was going to go to Vietnam. So we broke leaguer and drove back to the regiment and went to the mess to find out that it was confirmed that the CO and 2IC would pick the squadron that was going to go, and we'd be told within 24 hours.
When it was confirmed, what was the reaction within your troop?
Oh, great delight in the main. I had about a half a dozen national servicemen, some of who didn't want to go, and so they didn't. Some of who wanted to go, but whose national service time was up. But in the main, he was what we'd been training for.
How did your married soldiers deal with the deployment to South Vietnam?
Well, I only had 2 married soldiers, and of course they were senior NCOs, and they were much more mature, and their marital relationship was stable, so there really wasn't a problem. The regimental side, we switched into gear the family support plan, and because it was only one of the squadrons of the regiment, it left a lot of other people back at Pucka to take care of the families.
What do you consider was the most important aspect of your pre-deployment training?
Oh, certainly the concentration on individual crew drills and skills, individual crewman skills.
In retrospect, what do you consider was some of the shortcomings of the training that you received?
We spent far too much time at Canungra doing infantry minor tactics when we should have been learning to operate our virtually new tank, because we had a new gunnery system, a new fuel tank, a new infrared system, and it was quite a different vehicle to the one that we'd trained on prior to the warning for Vietnam.
What remains your most vivid memory of your time in South Vietnam?
It would have to be the battles or the contacts we had around Fire Support Base Coral. And even though we weren't, I wasn't involved in the ground attacks on Coral, we were subjected to the fire that went in, diversionary fire that went in whilst Balmoral was being attacked. And then of course there were the contacts with C and D companies at 1RAR.
So describe the events that led up to your deployment to Fire Support Base Coral.
We were deployed as a protection party for an engineering road clearing team or a land clearing team, and we would go out during the day, form an outer perimeter, and they'd conduct their work. We'd come back in at night, and about every second night we'd have a resupply from the base at Nui Dat, and with the resupply would come news of the Fire Support Base Coral, its establishment, its nearly being overrun, and the fact that there was a fairly big battle up there made us all a little bit restless.
What occurred then?
We finished our time with the land clearing team and went back into Nui Dat, where we had a fairly serious maintenance time, and were then told that we were deploying north. It was a road move of about 60 to 80 miles, which was a fair distance for the old Centurions, and we went about getting the vehicles ready and getting ourselves ready.
When you arrived at Coral, at one stage you deployed with only 2 tanks. Could you describe the incident that caused them?
It It was after we had been at Coral for about 10 days and we were in need of the normal fairly heavy maintenance. We all needed spark plug changes, and in Centurion that takes about 12 hours. So I decided that I'd do one tank at a time, and it was on a day that we had been warned that we would not be required to go out on patrol. And on that same day, C Company 1RAR, Digger Campbell, who I mentioned earlier, was one of the staff at RMC when I was there, took his company out, and they got into strife, and we were then deployed to go and join them. I left with 3 tanks, but my Bravo broke down just as we got outside the wire, and I was then given another tank from SHQ. We went about another 200 yards, and my Charlie then broke down, so I was left with just my tank, and the tank from SHQ plus the ARV and the fitters track. I must say the squadron commander, Major Peter Badman, did give me the option of going or staying, but I knew that it was Digger Campbell, and as I said, one of his platoon commanders was a very close friend, so we went on.
Describe what happened when you arrived at Major Campbell's company.
Well, they had been in contact for about an hour and had been probably even more, and had been subjected to 2 or 3 counterattacks. The APCs that had dropped them on the edge of the scrub had been trying to crash through to get into their position, but not having much success. And I lined the 2 tanks up and we drove straight into the noise of the battle. And when we got there, I drove around in front of the company, fairly delicately picking our way between infantry casualties on the ground. And we proceeded to clear the scrub with canister and then pick individual targets that we would engage the bunkers with APCBC and machine gun. It was also the stage where the first time I've ever had to fire an artillery mission. The artillery came up on my troop net, and I think I said something like, if you can take it north about 200 yards, we'd all be very happy. Also at that stage, the American gunships came in on my troop net, and they said that they could see lots of bad guys, as they said, lots of bad guys moving through the scrub, and they were about to engage. So we all gave a cheer and said, go ahead.
How did you communicate with your other call signs, and more particularly with infantry on the ground whilst you were moving in that sort of country?
With the infantry, it was always a problem because our radio sets were incompatible. And for planned operations, we always had the option of, or we always had the chance to confirm that the radio frequencies they'd be operating on were compatible with our sets. But where we were not, where it was not a planned operation, such as the one that I've just described, the infantry would go out on their own frequencies, and when we finally got out to them, through a very complicated set of procedures, we then all changed radio frequency so that we could at least talk to each other. Within the troop, we would communicate with radio, hand signals, also because you're so close, just a nod and a wave or a shake of the head.
How effective do you think tanks are in close country?
Oh, there's no doubt they save infantry casualties.
Your after-action reports detail that you had to get out of the turret at one stage to engage enemy infantry close to your tank. Where were you supporting infantry at that stage?
Well, I didn't actually get out of the turret. I just leaned over and dropped a grenade into a pit that was firing at us. We were all a bit concerned at this machine gun fire and where it was coming from, and no one could pick it. And it turns out that I was sitting, or the tank was sitting on top of it. So I just reached out and dropped a grenade over the side. No, I didn't actually get out.
Did you, as a result of that, did you travel the whole time opened up, even when artillery was supporting you?
Yes, you always left the hatch open, but whether or not you were actually outside the vehicle would depend on how close the contact was.
Okay. Sir, in some of your after-action reports, you described that the enemy, when they realised that the RPG could not immobilise the tank, aimed at the crew commander. How did you counter this?
Well, there wasn't much you could do. It just made it very unnerving. You just push on harder. The reason that I made that comment was I saw this guy actually stand up and aim at me, and that's when it became a bit personal.
In close country, what difficulties did you have identifying friend from foe?
Great difficulty, great difficulty. In the end, we decided that we would not shoot until the infantry had told us that all of their soldiers were behind the tanks.
So what drills were in fact developed to confirm that they were behind the tanks?
Well, generally the infantry would move in the company. They'd move 2 platoons up, then the company headquarters, and the troop of tanks behind the company headquarters. When the contact was established, say front left, we would drive forward and meet the infantry platoon commander. Invariably it was just a wave as we went past, and then we would push forward until he called out that, or radioed, that we were in front of his forward troops.
Initially, in my readings, there appears to have been a reluctance to employ tanks. Was this the case, and why was that so?
The overall picture of the tanks to Vietnam, yes, they didn't get up there until 1968. Mainly, I think, because the higher echelons of the army still thought that we were fighting in Malaya.
Do you consider that the Centurion was a reliable tank?
I guess it's all relative. When you compare it to, say, the Leopard now, it certainly was not reliable, but at the time it was appropriately reliable. In fact, it got better the more we used it up there.
What modifications were made to the Centurion prior to your departure and when you arrived in South Vietnam?
Prior to departure, we had the new 100-gallon fuel tank put on the back, had the new gun sight, had the ranging machine gun, and then when we got up there we found that a lot of the attachments, the mud guards had to be cut back, the side screens had to be taken off because they were ripped off in the scrub. We put some additional armour across the mud guards to give them a bit more strength. We put 2 new road wheel on the glassy plate, and we added brackets at the back of the turret cupola for machine gun ammunition.
The ranging gun and the Mark 40 sights, which were introduced prior to your departure from Australia, did you have time to train on those prior to your departure?
Not really. We were too concerned with doing our infantry minor tactics, which will bug me till I leave the services. But we finally got our squadron together. We had a 1-week exercise, and then we had to go on leave before we went off to Vietnam. The gunnery phase, as everybody knows, of the young officers course is about 4 weeks, and we had a totally new gunnery system, and we had less than a week to come to grips with it.
Did your troop adapt well and quickly to that modification?
Well, I'd have to say yes, but we certainly spent a lot of time on the range at Nui Dat before we went out on operations.
Given the age of the vehicle and the country you were operating in, what were some of the limitations of the Centurion?
The major limitation, I think, was that it was designed for a much colder area of operations. The fan belt system for the drive system really relied on the outside temperature being a lot less than it was in Vietnam.
What modifications were made to crew and troop drills when you arrived?
Well, the biggest modification was that we operated much more closely together. I mean, if you're going through the scrub, you would really have more than 10 feet between the vehicles, because more than that you certainly couldn't see, or you wouldn't be able to support them.
South Vietnam was the first time that Australia had employed tanks on operations since World War II. Who developed the concept for employment of tanks in South Vietnam?
I think it started when Major Gordon Murphy, who was the commander of the Cav Squadron at the time, sent back to Australia a fairly detailed paper on how he thought the tanks would operate, and that became the basis then of the argument for sending the tanks up there.
How were tanks employed during wet weather?
It really didn't make much difference. It's just that we didn't drive over Paddyfield. We seemed to drive everywhere else.
Your training in Australia beforehand, how applicable was that?
The crew drills and the individual troop drills were very good. However, the squadron drills for squadron operations in northwest Europe were totally inappropriate.
Did any personal problems develop within the troop? And if they did, how did you deal with them?
I can honestly say I don't recall any. We had no cases of malaria, no cases of VD. We had the normal run of bad news stories from home, but I thought that we were a fairly close troop, and in fact on the 20-year reunion, of the 24 people that went through my troop, all 24 came back for the reunion and all were in good heart. None had suffered any massive trauma, and all were delighted to have a beer together again.
In line with that, what had an effect on morale?
Probably the biggest effect was mail from home, and when the postal strike was on in Australia, that really was a downer.
Describe the events that led up to the Punch a Postie When You Get Home campaign.
I think it was a program that started obviously in an office somewhere that had access to a Roneo copier, and the posters that circulated were quite humorous and really, I think, in hindsight, were a good safety valve.
How did the troop deal with this mail holdup?
Well, like other problems, you would get together and through your camaraderie or through your total impact, overcome it.
How important was humour during this period?
I think it was very important. I mean, whilst it was a very serious business, to be able to see the funny side of some of the things was important too.
Would you describe the incident where your troop sergeant drove over a mine?
We had been driving near the Courtenay Rubber, and the squadron headquarters had just asked for a sitrep, and I said everything is fine and we're moving along this line, and sudden Callis's tank hit this almighty mine. I think it was a 250-pound bomb that had been command detonated. We immediately went into a mine drill, and before I could ask him how he was, he radioed back to the troops saying, "Don't forget to take your Paludan tonight," which had the marvellous effect of relieving the tension of, holy mackerel, what's happened to Alpha?
What was your standard mine drill?
Because you didn't know whether they were command detonated or whether they were just pressure detonated, and also the vehicle was immobilised, we would go into all-round defence and prop there, making sure that if it was command detonated, the most likely sites for the fellow who had detonated it were covered, and if that then didn't happen, we'd take stock of it. Invariably an engineer team would be flown in, the area would be checked for other mines, and then we'd get on with repairing the tank.
Describe the events that led to the death of Trooper Hannaford.
Trooper Hannaford was in 3 Troop, and his troop was deployed with an American force, and they were driving along a track, or a trail as they were called, that were known to be visited by the miners, and I understand his was the lead tank, and it hit a fairly heavy mine that was offset, so that went off underneath the body of the tank and not the track, as had happened with all of the other incidents.
How did you deal with that news when you heard about it?
Well, personally, that was in the time that I was the LO. It must have been very late in the year, and I was isolated at an Arvin base, so I didn't have any contact with the squadron other than by radio, and I must say it finally brought it all home to me.
Trooper Hannaford, in fact, had made an error of judgment in that he'd replaced the plug the wrong way. Was that the cause of his death?
I don't know. I would say that the size of the blast and the impact that it had on the vehicle would have meant that he wouldn't have survived anyway.
In the early stages of your deployment, one of your tanks caught fire as a result of... I'll do that again.
10 minutes, 10 seconds.
In the early stages of your deployment, one of your tanks caught fire as a result of fire from a friendly APC. Could you describe that event and how you dealt with it?
Yes, I had my 3 tanks, an ARV and a fitter's track, and a platoon of infantry and APCs, and we were patrolling in the light green. I had the tanks leading, and the front left tank either hit a mine or was fired on by an RPG. I called contact left, and we did a left stick to drive into the area from which the fire came. I told the infantry to dismount and cover the rear. The infantry commander, who was a Kiwi, promptly told me that we were in a minefield and he wasn't going to get out. I hadn't come across that situation. I always thought people did as you were told. And we then turned left again, so we were driving then parallel to the direction in which we were initially going, when a burst of small arms fire was directed at the APCs, who returned fire, and one of the APCs with a 50 calibre fired into where he thought the enemy fire was coming from, and either a ricochet or a straight round went into the 100-gallon fuel tank of my Alpha. Of course, we didn't know that at the time, and the fuel tank burst into flame. The vehicle, whilst it wasn't damaged, the fire was spreading onto the rubber road wheel tracks and the bump rails on the back of the engine decks. So I drove over, and we took the crew and put them on the back of my vehicle.
Thank you. Do you want to change tapes now? What was your reaction during this incident, sir?
Well, the adrenaline took over, and we just went straight into our contact drill. After things had quietened down and there was obviously no further enemy action about to take place, we recovered the situation, put the fire out on Alpha, unloaded the main armament, which had a canister in it, and formed up in a massive convoy and drove back to our fire support base.
Describe the effect that mortar and artillery fire had on and around your vehicle.
I don't think we ever got to the stage of having them land on or near the vehicle, but I certainly remember at Coral with the digger Campbell contact, enemy mortars falling about 30 to 40 metres away from us, and of course everybody ducked anyway. The bigger problem was small arms that were still rattling through the trees.
How did you adjust to the noise of combat?
I don't think you can ever adjust to it. There are things that just cannot be duplicated in training. I mean, an RPG going off sounds like an express train as it goes past you, and then when it explodes, it's an almighty bang. And at the same time, 2 or 3 other machine guns will be firing alongside of you. As I mentioned earlier, the tank alongside was very close, and if it was firing, there's just no way you can duplicate that. I think what we must do is let people know that it is going to be very noisy.
At any stage, have you been able to simulate At any stage, have you been able to simulate this in your subsequent training?
Not really. I concentrated on making people aware of the fact that there was going to be massive noise. I remember the nearest thing that we've ever got to it was an OCS training exercise where we used all of the year's pyrotechniques for the final battle, and the cadets that graduated that year, I think, got a good taste of it.
When you were in a defensive position, whereabouts did you sleep in respect of your vehicle?
We would have the 4 tanks able to fire. One tank would be the guard tank, and it would be the turret of which would be manned, and the infrared light would be used for a sweep at odd times during the night. And so the turret crew from that vehicle slept in a hole in the ground. The rest of the crew slept in their vehicles, in their positions.
Why was this?
Well, I was not convinced that if we slept on the ground that we'd be able to get from the ground into our vehicle safely.
When the tanks were in a defensive position, where were you held?
It varied each time. If the defensive position was on the edge of the jungle, then we would be positioned on the open side of the jungle. If we were positioned out in a general open area, we'd be held centrally, and we would have worked out routes by which we would get to the perimeter to fire if we had to move during the night.
What problems were encountered when you were trying to deploy tanks around a position at night under fire?
The biggest problem was convincing the infantry we weren't going to run over them, and we would overcome this by actually walking the course, talking to the people in each of the pits. When we finally get to the fire position, talking to the people in the pits there and trying to bring to their comprehension the impact of this beast arriving in the middle of the night that was going to then fire canister, which would just burst their ears if they were too close.
Did you rehearse these movements by day and by night?
Yes, we did, and that also got the infantry used to the fact that we'd be moving.
Did you have much interaction with Allied armies?
No. The only time we had anything to do with the Americans was when the gunships that I mentioned at Coral, or when their self-propelled artillery was deployed in to support us.
Would you comment on the quality and detail of the briefings and orders groups that you received during your time in South Vietnam?
Well, generally the deployments were very well planned, and we had very timely orders. In fact, enough time for me to prepare detailed orders and give them generally the day before. Once we deployed to an area of operations, the orders then varied, or the quality of the orders then varied with the urgency of the situation, such as with the contact with Tony Hammett's company. We had orders the previous day, and that was a very detailed preparation. For the Digger Campbell deployment, we really got orders on the run and drove to the sound of the battle.
Was directive control exercised in those situations?
Yes, very, very much. I mean, we were given the resources, given the mission, and told to go and do it.
What perceptions did you have of the higher command whilst you were a troop leader?
I don't think it ever occurred to me that they were not doing the best they possibly could, although the delay in getting the tanks up to Coral did cause me some concern. But you must appreciate your horizons were fairly shallow, and to be totally involved in your troop gave you very little time for pondering the greater course of the battle.
Did this perception change when you were appointed as ADC?
Yes, very much. And it was there that I could see quite clearly that a lot of the operations that people went on were publicity operations. The seriousness of some of the redeployment of the Vietnamese, the statistics that were being fed, a lot were being politically rather than militarily driven.
Could you describe your responsibilities in ADC to an operational commander?
Well, the commander of the Australian Force Vietnam wasn't really an operational commander. He had no control over the brigade or the task force at Nui Dat. He had administrative responsibilities and had a grand impact, if you like, on the interpersonal relationships of the hierarchy in Saigon. And I saw our job there as to represent a dynamic and keen and interested and capable small force. And in fact, the task force had got a very good reputation, and so we really didn't have to do much work on that count. And all of the Americans were interested in what we were doing and how, and General Hayes spent a lot of time trying to convince the Americans that they probably should look at some of the ways that we operated, and and we would look favourably at requests for them to send people down to operate with us.
What is the most vivid memory of this appointment?
The most vivid memory would have to be my my job interview, I suppose. I was in the field out of Nui Dat as a caretaker troop leader for John Wilson's troop. John was back in Sydney in Australia getting married, and I was asked to go and see the brigadier about a future job. So a helicopter took me from the tank to the brigade headquarters, where I was asked if I wanted to stay on, and I said yes, of course. And the brigadier said, in Saigon? And I said, oh no, not really. And he said, I think you would like that. Take my chopper and go back to Nui Dat, get a pair of grey slacks, white shirt, a tie, some black socks and shoes, and present yourself to the commander in Saigon. So that afternoon I did, and that evening at a dinner party with the finest of china and silver and linen napkins, I tried to visualise what I'd been doing a mere 6 hours before.
That was a very surreal experience.
Very much so, yeah.
How did you adjust when you returned home?
I didn't come straight home. I went off to America for 3 months. We had an AIDS club in Saigon, and through the other captains we arranged that I should visit 34 American bases. And so I flew to America courtesy of the US Air Force, and then they flew me back to Australia.
How did your soldiers adjust?
The National Service soldiers took their discharge. The regular soldiers served on, and in fact the first time I saw them was at the Armoured Centre, when I arrived at the Armoured Centre with the OCS class, and they all seemed keen and normal, and in fact at the 20-year reunion when we all got together again, they certainly were keen and normal.
What do you consider to be the most important aspect of your time in South Vietnam?
The most important aspect, I think, was the value of team spirit and proficiency at basic skills and basic drills.
How have you employed this experience in your training since that time?
I have really pushed the need for people to be very good at what their basic trade is and basic skill. I think if the basic skills and the basic drills are there, then they can be employed in any tactics, be it the rolling plains of Northern Europe or bashing through the scrub.
You've stated that the noise of combat was something that you were not... do that again. You stated that the noise of combat was something that you weren't prepared for. How can we achieve this noise in training? And what was that? Okay. You stated that the noise of combat was something that you were not prepared for. How can we achieve this in our current training within our current safety limitations, or can we?
Well, the first thing we have to do is make people aware that it is going to happen. And then I would think that there are times when we can employ all sorts of noise and smoke and those sorts of generating mechanisms that will get people used to it. But once again, it is something that I don't think can be duplicated.
You also have used as an aid for training at times the recording of troop and squadron nets. Do you think this is a good training aid, and why?
Yes, I bought some small tape recorders and put them inside turrets to make sure that the distraction of turret chatter was kept to a minimum. And in fact, that proved to be a boon in other areas, because there's nothing like the adrenaline of the inside of a tank turret in a contact. And that was one way that we were able to get through to people the idea of just what was going on and who was doing things, and the speed of reaction that was necessary, and also the fact that the drills that we had learnt, the gunnery drills, the techniques for clearing stoppages, and all the shouting is absolutely necessary, and people do need to go step by step through their gunnery drills.
Do you think our current approach to mobility is still entrenched in the static warfare of Korea or the limited mobility warfare of Malaya and South Vietnam?
No, I don't. I think the mobility that armoured vehicles demonstrated on both K-89 and K-92 has shown that we have got a good grasp of the benefits of mobility, the force multiplier effect of mobility, if you will. To be able to move a squadron of Leopards 30 and 40 miles in an hour and a half and be ready to fight then is something that we've never had before. And I think we are not tied into static ideas.
Describe how relevant you think our experience in South Vietnam is to our current low-level training. Correction. I'll do that again. Describe how relevant you think. I'm losing it. Take three. It's a low-level conflict question.
Right.
I've only got two to
Do you think?
Yeah. Describe how relevant you think our experience in South Vietnam is to training for low-level conflict.
Oh, well, I've no doubt that there are a number of tactical drills that we learnt and perfected in Vietnam will apply to low-level conflict in Australia. You need to be able to find the enemy firstly, then pin him, hold him, and then arrive with massive firepower to defeat him. There's no point in sending Australian infantry riflemen armed with a rifle up against enemy infantrymen armed with a rifle. There's no point in fighting fair. You want to fight to win, and if that means driving in there with a tank, well then we should be doing that, because that saves an awful lot of infantry casualties. The techniques of coordinate search, patrolling, night operations. I mean, the night fighting capability of the Leopard now is magnificent compared to the old Centurion.
Finally, sir, what would you consider to be the most important thing a junior commander needs to remember?
Without a doubt, he needs to be confident that both he and his soldiers have got their basic skills off pat.
Sir, thank you for your time.
Thank you. It was appropriately reliable. In fact, it got better the more we used it up there.
What modifications were made to the Centurion prior to your departure and when you arrived in South Vietnam?
Prior to departure, we had the new 100-gallon fuel tank put on the back, had the new gun sight, had the ranging machine gun, and then when we got up there, we found that a lot of the attachments, the mud guards had to be cut back. The side screens had to be taken off because they were ripped off in the scrub. We put some additional armour across the mud guards to give them a bit more strength. We put 2 new road wheel on the glassy plate, and we added brackets at the back of the turret cupola for machine gun ammunition.
The ranging gun and the Mark 40 sights, which were introduced prior to your departure from Australia, did you have time to train on those prior to your departure?
Not really. We were too concerned with doing our infantry minor tactics, which will bug me till I leave the services. But we finally got our squadron together. We had a 1-week exercise, and then we had to go on leave before we went off to Vietnam. The gunnery phase, as everybody knows, of the young officers course is about 4 weeks, and we had a totally new gunnery system, and we had less than a week to come to grips with it.
Did your troop adapt well and quickly to that modification?
Well, I'd have to say yes. But we certainly spent a lot of time on the range at Nui Dat before we went out on operations.
Given the age of the vehicle and the country you were operating in, what were some of the limitations of the Centurion?
The major limitation, I think, was that it was designed for a much colder area of operations. The fan belt system for the drive system really relied on the outside temperature being a lot less than it was in Vietnam.
What modifications were made to crew and troop drills when you arrived?
Well, the biggest modification